when we brought your book to our Northwest salesperson, and he's lived here since the 80s, he ran away to Panama to protest things that were going on at that time. But, so he's like a political radical. Yeah. And when we said, we're considering this book, he said, I think that would be really meaningful, and I think it would be doubly meaningful if you did it because you don't just do books like that. And I thought that was a really interesting take because, to me, I'm like, okay, this is cool history. It's tragically contemporary. It's not like that stuff ended in the 90s.
Hi, I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 28 years.
I'm Ellie Blue, the Vice President of Microcosm. We started this podcast to share what we've learned with newer publishers, so you can learn from our mistakes. Or maybe you just want to learn about the publishing industry. This episode is an interview with Craig Rosebraugh, author of Burning Rage of a Dying Planet, yes. One of Microcosm's newest books.
The Earth Liberation Front versus the FBI? Mm-hmm.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Thanks for having
me. Joining us in our secret location. And so you wrote this book almost 20 years ago, or I guess more than 20 years ago that you wrote it probably. So why bring it back?
I felt that, after 20 years, the book was really written in 2003, it came out in 2004. So at that particular time, the court cases hadn't actually gone on yet. Most of the ELF members hadn't been captured yet. Right. So it was kind of still in the midst of the entire movement. And so there was a whole history that really hadn't been told as to what happened to this movement and how was it brought down, what did the FBI do, what did the activists do, etc. And then beyond that, there's a very interesting history of how the book was written in the first place.
Yes, can you please tell us about
that?
Which
we now know to be true.
Yes, we do. And so that, I felt that all those reasons combined, it was time, especially with everything that is going on today in terms of climate change and the climate crisis and different activist components trying to make a difference. I think it's more than important to have a history out there that people can learn from and identify what actually was helpful back then and what was a complete disaster and what was a mistake, etc.
Yeah. Can you tell us the story of how the book came to be in the first place?
Sure. So I used to speak a lot at colleges, universities, conferences, etc. about the ELF, and I was approached in 2001 by a man named Robert Erringer, and he claimed to be a book packager. He said he had recently heard me speak at one of my speaking gigs and was interested in me writing a book, and he would help me publish it. And he kind of defined a book packager as different than an agent. A book packager would be someone who found good stories and the authors to write them, and they would help package the whole thing and then eventually sell it to a publishing house. So he was very complimentary, said he was very interested in the work, that it would be a great sale. And initially I was like, no, if I'm going to write a book about the ELF, I'll do it on my own time, and I had no interest at that time in doing it. So I said no, but he was very persistent, and over the next better part of 6 months, 9 months, he kept on with emails constantly asking to meet. And so finally, I decided to meet with him and just hear him out and see what he wanted to do. So he paid for an all-expense, I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time here, and he paid for an all-expense paid trip to Santa Barbara and put me up in a beachfront hotel, and spent the weekend wining and dining me, trying to convince me that he was, the person for the job to help me write this book and to sell it to the worldwide market. And I was paranoid at the time because of everything I had been through. So I went down to LA and grabbed my sister and brought her up with me just so I could have a second buffer and a second opinion on, should these guys be trusted, And before I had gone down, I'll just say I had done as much research as I could. I looked on the internet at the time, and these individuals Robert Ehringer claimed to be a book packager, and he had book credits to his name. So, as much as I could tell, they were authentic. Not only in attendance was Robert Ehringer at this meeting, but he had flown in, allegedly from Chicago, an editor by the name of Frank Martin.
Okay.
So myself and my sister Carrie met with both these individuals and, like I said, wined and dined us for the better part of a weekend. I mostly sat back and just stared while my sister, who's much more outgoing than I am, talked to these individuals. And, they're very outgoing. They're good at what they do. They're salesmen and very skilled at it. And so at the end of the weekend, both of us thought, they likely mean no harm, let's give them a try. So I was sent back up to Portland to create a book proposal, which I did. That was immediately accepted for me to write like a 450-page book. They wanted it done in 3 months, I think.
Oh, wow.
Which I thought was literally impossible. So I said, no, but I'll start. And the deal was that I was to write, this manuscript, and every 3 to 4 chapters, I would send them in and they would review them. And if they were approved, then either Robert or Frank would meet with me in person to kind of go over and get me started on the next set of chapters, as well as pay me an advance payment.
Okay.
So that relationship is the way the working relationship played out. Every 3 or 4 chapters, I would meet exclusively with Frank Martin. I never saw Robert Ehringer again in person. Frank Martin I met with at hotel suites around the country. I met with in my own personal home in Portland. And even one time I recall Frank Martin showed up for an editing session at my house carrying a gift for me, and this was an FBI baseball cap that he allegedly had got at a airport as a joke, because the stories about the ELF and the FBI, and he thought it would be a funny joke. Little foreshadowing there.
Wow.
And so at the end of, I completed in 9 months, I completed a 450-page manuscript, which at the time was more information out about the ELF than had ever been released before.
Yeah.
And everything at that point, to my knowledge, had been approved, at least in a rough draft form. So I figured, big sigh of relief, I can now just go on to the editing process, and there's not going to be as much substantial work. It's just going to be maybe rewrites and that kind of stuff. Little did I know, I received a message from Robert saying that both he and Frank had reviewed the manuscript, and they changed their mind that it was nowhere near the quality they needed to sell the book at any kind of book fair. And allegedly, Robert had already been shopping the book at like the Munich Book Fair and all these international book fairs, which I don't believe ever happened.
No.
It wouldn't make, like, you wouldn't sell a book like yours at the Munich, but like it's a domestic book. It's not of interest internationally.
I wasn't the most savvy at the time. I probably am not now.
Right. Sure.
So they wanted me basically to start from scratch, to throw everything out and start from scratch. And this was on, I would say this was on a Friday I received this call.
Wow.
And I was told that Frank Martin was flying back into Portland on the Monday to start the complete rewriting process over again with me. And what they specifically needed to know was more information about the real identities of the ELF members, what specific character traits they had, just more information about them. And I had told them from day one, I don't have that information.
Right,
and if I did, I'm certainly not going to include it in a book.
Yeah.
But that is what they wanted. So the call was left that he's flying back on Monday, and I have to start this rewrite process. So as you can imagine, my heart dropped. I mean, this was a huge portion of my year, and a lot of energy, a lot of emotion went into it, and I did not want to go back and have to redo that. So on Saturday night, I remember that weekend, I just got into a deep dive on the internet and trying to find out. It just didn't seem right to me. Like something seemed off. And I got into a deep dive on the internet and just kept on going page after page on one of those, like, it's probably like midnight or 1 a.m. You're like sleepless, like, I'm going to find something. I'm going to find something.
Right.
And I did. I found something. I found an article from Salon at the time, salon.com, that actually made me immediately just get the chills. It made me make sure every door in my house was locked, and anything I could use as a weapon I had near me. What I found was these individuals, there was an article on Robert Erringer that had come out of a recent court case at that time, where Robert had been involved with a situation where there was an author named Jan Potkin, and she was writing or attempting to write a book about the Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey circus empire. And supposedly she had inside information that if it was released would have potentially harmed them economically. And it wasn't, to my knowledge, as much about the animal cruelty as it was about the inhumane labor practices and the corruption and fraud and everything that went on with that company. And so it turns out that Robert Erringer was working for a very covert but high-level security firm that was run by the ex-director of covert operations for the CIA at the time. And their plot was to get Jan Potker to write a book about the Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey Circus, but at the same time ensure that that book never came out. So their plan was to get her to reveal as much information as she could by writing that book, yet at the same time make sure that it never was released to the public. And so they did that to some degree. She put out a lot of information, but at the same time, they started distracting her. So they actually got money from Ringling Brothers to get her to write a completely different book on the history of the Mars bar family. The CIA, was just a different beast. It was just a different beast, and it was something I was admittedly scared to death of, right? Yeah. So I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know who these guys were. At the time, they were working for this, very covert security firm. I didn't know if that still existed. If it did, I didn't know who hired them. I didn't know if it was an industry organization that did, if it was a government. I had no idea. But what I did know is they weren't book packagers, right?
Right.
They were someone else. And so that, and I had to go through, long story short, I went on that following Monday. I went very, very early in the morning to see my attorney in Portland. And I had all the documentation, all the emails that Frank and Robert had been sending back and forth to me over the years. I took that all in a pile and showed it to my attorneys. And at first they didn't believe me. And then they started reading through all of this, and their jaws just dropped. It's not every day that, a client walks into an attorney's office and presents this kind of spook, almost Hollywood-esque kind of situation.
Yeah.
So they advised me naturally that obviously these individuals aren't who they say they are. Do not have any contact with them whatsoever. Stay away from them until we figure out what to do. And so that morning, I go back, and around 9 o'clock or something, Frank Martin was knocking at my door. And so I sent a message to him and just said I was sick. I was not going to be able to meet. He continued Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday to come and knock at my door a few times throughout the day, sending me messages, calling me. And then finally, I got a message that he was leaving and heading back to Chicago. That's the last I ever heard from them whatsoever. So there was a situation actually with the manuscript, though, because they had given me this advance. There was a gray area if they own the rights. These mysterious individuals own the rights to the manuscript at the time. So it was something my attorneys brought up, and so they said the only way that you can, your best case legal scenario is to give back the advance with a note, a letter talking about the misrepresentation, etc. And so I did that to the last known address of Robert Erringer, who at the time had moved to London. I sent a check for every penny of the advance I had received, as well as this letter. I never heard back. I never heard anything else from them.
Did they cash
at that
the
time. Check? The check was cashed, yeah.
Oh, very interesting.
So from that point on, for years, I had no idea who these individuals were. I found the book did come out originally on Lannard Books in 2004. And from 2004 through about 2022, somewhere in there, I was living in the same state of not knowing who these individuals were. Always wondering, always wondering. And then through a series of, I applied for my Freedom of Information Act file that the FBI had. I ended up filing a lawsuit against the Department of Justice for them failing to provide my entire FBI file. It turned out to be 22,000 pages that I did receive over an extended length of time. They would release 500 pages per month, and obviously a lot of it was heavily redacted. But that information, in addition to an unnamed source, confirmed that the individuals that went by the name of Robert Erringer and Frank Martin were working for the FBI at the time in a counterintelligence program that was designed to try to get me to provide as much information as I could about the identities of the individuals in the ELF so they could go and make arrests, get indictments, and make arrests and prosecute. And of course, I never did. I didn't have the information, and if I did, I wouldn't have shared it. But that was their ploy, and they were very good at what they did. I'll say that they were very good at what they did. But looking back at it now, it's definitely a frustrating experience.
It's terrifying.
But it's also nice to have closure to some degree. It's also nice to know, after all these years, who were those shadowy characters.
What actually happened? Joe, from a publishing perspective, would you have seen red flags there, or is that all kind of above board?
Yeah, because if someone represents themselves as a packager, that means all they need are the details. Mm-hmm. They don't need you to write it. They just need you, and then they wouldn't say, we're throwing this away now. They would come back and say, on October 7th, you said you had tofu for breakfast. Who were you sitting with? They would need that kind of infill, or they would be like, you said there were 3 people, but this report said there were 4. And a ghostwriter would then come in and make it flourishy and like a mystery novel. They would give it flair and then bring it back to you and be like, is this accurate? We changed some things. There would be no point in consuming you like that unless the point was obfuscation, which apparently it was,
or something like an interrogation,
right?
And
I don't know, I guess that's the part too where if you're up front from the beginning, I don't know these details so I can't provide them. Then it's when they come back and say, hey, we need those details you couldn't provide, you're like, well, what?
Yeah. And I mean, that obviously set you off too, because no editorial process is ever going to be oh, we need more details, so let's write the book again from scratch.
That doesn't make
They're going to be let's add the details.
And of course, they had played it as the buyers. I always went back to the buyers are going to really need this information, and I'm thinking, but I told you from day one I don't have it, and if I did, I'm not going to provide it. Right. So.
And the packager would also, they would take, they would have photos from somebody else, and they would they would be making a package, and it would be a package of more than your own work. Is sort of the crux of the matter here, or they would be looking at it and combining you with something, which in reality, I guess it's right. But yeah, it's a different time, 2003. It's very I don't know, it's still a time when like there was money in publishing books because there wasn't quite the flooded market.
Yeah.
You know, so it would kind of it would hold up because, you know, like it's akin today to like what an author services company does, which is like they seize onto your ego and they're like, you're a very important person and we think like your story would benefit a lot of people and like this is a really great book, you know, and then it's never getting around to the point where like to the offer being fulfilled.
Yeah.
You know?
God, I guess I keep thinking what we should call this episode, like how to avoid being set up by the FBI and telling you that you have a book deal.
Right.
Well, I think, I mean, from my own personal story, I think the FBI, some members, even the some that are retired today, still believe that I knew.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
100% of the FBI, or the ELF membership at the time, and so this was one of the ways that they, you know, felt that they could try to get that out of me.
Right, that you had like a roster and a flow chart.
Yeah.
You would just...
But from a, you know, publishing standpoint, I didn't have any knowledge at that point, and I didn't have anybody to go to.
Right.
There wasn't like no one. I mean, I'm assuming if I really looked, I could have found, you know, some referrals and some advice and some kind of guidance with that
but they
situation.
Wouldn't have necessarily caught it either.
Yeah, that's true. But I didn't. I was so used to going about things just on my own, you know, for years, and also not trusting anybody, you know, because of what I'd been through. That I figured, all right, let's give it a try.
So when you did end up working with a publisher to publish the book, like what was that like? Like how did you find one that you trusted?
Yeah, right.
So I had known of Lantern prior. I had read some of their books, so I felt they were, you know, at least an above board publisher, an actual publisher, and not just something out of, you know,
not
thin air. Yes. And they were, I believe, my first top choice, just based on what they had done, you know, with their slate of publications. And they were genuinely interested in the story. It was quite a pleasure to work with them. At the time, I worked with, you know, someone that went through and edited the piece with me, the manuscript with me, and naturally they wanted to be sure that, you know, that the rights to the manuscript were fully
right. Didn't think of that.
Yeah. But other than that, it was a great experience. It was a great experience, and it was, you know, I will say that I'm glad that first edition came out, because I don't think with everything I had going on back at that time period that I would have taken the time and blocked that out and really recorded that history in written form if it hadn't been for the FBI.
Thanks,
right.
So thanks, FBI.
Right. So they hoodwinked you, but the outcome wasn't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
You know, and that was the other thing too, where because I when I read the story in the book, that was my first thought. I was like, how would I have felt if I had been tricked into writing this book? Would I have then been like, well, I'll give them what they want, we'll publish the book, you know? But and I'm like, and I'm back and forth on that, you know, because it's like, you know, around the time of, you know, the late 90s, early 2000s in Portland, you know, like I was involved with the Liberation Collective and those things and like that aspect of the city. And like, you know, and I like remember, you know, I wasn't like to the level of scrutiny that you were facing, but like, you know, our phones were tapped and like, you know, and I found this out because the phone company told me, you know, and it was like one of those kind of things. And, you know, and it makes you paranoid.
Yeah.
And it makes you paranoid because you're like, I'm a book publisher. Like, why are you hassling me? You know, like, what do you think? And, you know, and they sent somebody to like try to convince us to burn down a gas station, and it was like one of those things where I'm like, that's just like pointless violence. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
it's like not, and you know, and even when I was like asking the guy, like, what's the strategy here? He would be like, oh, you know, like fuck shit up.
Random
Like,
chaos.
It's like, that is not a strategy. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
I get it, you have feelings,
Yeah.
but like this is not. And I think
Yeah.
about that, and I'm like, you know, if I was like younger and angrier, like I may have gone for that.
Well, that, you know, not to get off topic too much, but that was the case with Eric McDavid,
Yeah.
where the FBI literally sent in a young woman at the time. Yeah.
So yeah, that like entrapment method, yeah, maybe if they had sent a cuter person, like I would have totally gone for it. Like maybe if it was better thought out, I don't know. I think about that kind of thing a lot. But the angle I wanted to go is that, you know, like I was a young punk rocker, and I was like and I got into politics through that vehicle, and it wasn't until I moved to Portland and I met like people who came at that from another modality, you know, essentially like grew up and had those values elsewhere. So like where, and you know, normally when I ask people this sort of question, like they get kind of tripped up, is they're like, it just is. But so where did you discover like your political convictions, if not punk rock?
I think a mixture. I grew up so I was born here in Portland at Emmanuel, and I grew up in Tigard. At the time, Tigard was, the back part of it was still all farmland. So my backyard bordered on hundreds of acres of forest and fields, and that was my playground growing up. So nature, I didn't think of it at the time, but it really was a part of my life. So I had that backdrop growing up, and then I did get involved heavily in the punk rock scene in Portland. Played in bands for years, and I was in kind of the peace punk movement. So a lot of the bands that I was influenced by were from Europe, from England, and we're talking about the Crass, Conflict, you know, bands that have political lyrics talking about you know, injustice and animal rights and all these interesting causes. And so I would, like a lot of people of the day, I would get a new album and rip it open and read the sleeves and find out all the information about, you know, the band and what they believed in, and read all the lyrics. And so I started to become educated through those means on different social justice issues, and it started to make sense to me. And at that time, this was around 1990, and at that time, this was when the U.S. was first thrusting itself into the Gulf War, and there were massive protests downtown. And there were teach-ins, and really on both sides of the issue. There was pro-war rallies going on, anti-war rallies, and I was raised in a very Republican, fairly conservative household, and so I honestly didn't know where I sat on anything, you know. But I liked being exposed to all the issues, and it made sense to me at the time that the government was going in primarily for resources and regional power, and so I didn't really think the war was necessary, and so I joined the anti-war movement, and at the same time then joined a local animal rights group called People for Animal Rights, which was one of the original kind of PETA offshoots around the country. And I went from being like a shy kid that just kind of sat in the back and watched all these people talk about these big issues, to attending protests and holding a sign, to eventually organizing protests for that group, and, you know, organizing different events. We used to feed vegetarian food at homeless shelters. We did Food Not Bombs. We did a lot of stuff back then. And then we also started taking part in civil disobedience for the first time. And that was fairly radical for that organization. But we started blockading like the Oregon Regional Primate Research Center and Good Samaritan Hospital that was involved in medical testing on cats. We started blocking their facilities to raise awareness about those issues. And the group, we also took a supportive stance on an organization that I had first read about in those record jackets from England called the ALF, the Animal Liberation Front. And they would go and rescue animals from laboratories. And that eventually they would recognize that once they rescued animals from laboratories, those laboratories would just buy more the next day. So they started rescuing animals from laboratories and smashing the equipment that was used to test on them to make that price of the injustice a little bit higher. And so we took an ideological stance in support of that, and that was a little bit too radical for that organization. So a number of us at the time decided, let's just start another organization. This group is great, but let's start another one where we can be a little more free to, support these type of causes. So that's where we started Liberation Collective in Portland. And Liberation Collective's whole motto was to link different social justice movements together to find the commonality in all of them, as well as support a variety of tactics and strategies in order to make the world a better place. And that was there at Liberation Collective that we not only continued our campaigns of civil disobedience and protesting against various animal issues and human rights issues, etc., but it's where I also received the first communication from first the ALF, and then I started receiving communications from a new group called the ELF, the Earth Liberation Front, and then it spiraled from there.
And the rest is history.
In the book. The rest is in the book.
Quite a bit, yeah.
One of the questions we get asked most often on the podcast, or not most often, but a question we get from time to time on the podcast is people who are really concerned about the controversial material in their book bringing unwanted attention to themselves, or like kind of creating an unsafe situation for maybe people that they write about in their book, or for their author, or for themselves. Do you have any advice for that?
It's a good question. I would say if I can speak to my particular case, and my book is essentially a memoir, but it's a memoir telling a history of a social movement, political movement that went on. Yeah. And while it's largely about me, it's also about individuals unknown, and the individuals unknown were unknown to me at that time. So I didn't have that information to share in the sense that I put them in no danger from a legal standpoint, from a physical standpoint, anything like that. But obviously, perhaps there could have been further danger toward me, and that's the only thing I could control. And at that point, I felt that this information, it's better to have that out there. It's more important to have that out there than to worrying about what is going to occur to me. And you also have to remember that any kind of enemy that you're going to have, whether it's, the far, far right, whether it's corporations, governments, law enforcement, they would have to actually read your book. They would have to take the time to read your book. And not that the FBI hasn't done that. I'm sure they have in this particular case. But they'd actually have to read your book and understand it in order to formulate some animosity to come after you and do anything, whether it's online hate or physical threats or whatever it is. So I think obviously you want to be cautious and you want to take care of yourself and make sure you're not harming others by including information that could lead to others being threatened or harmed. But you also have to look at the greater good and figure out, is this more important to have this out there than worrying, am I as an author going to be targeted? And in most cases, if you're writing about something that is important, then you want to have it out there.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think about this too, where I see all the time where people divulge crimes they've committed in their book, and largely not thinking about it or unknowingly, and then there's kind of no consequence because it's not like the FBI is sitting there reading every book out there.
Yeah,
Like, how
yeah.
could they?
Yeah.
And there's just, there's 160 million books. And it's like,
Yeah.
but I think about it from the sense of like, who is actually going to read it and what are they going to get out of it?
Yeah.
But so, and then speaking of, can we talk a little bit about the film project?
Sure.
So you're now going deeper now that a lot of more information has been revealed in the last 20 years, let's say. So what prompted this project and what is it?
So I have been working in the film industry for the last 15 years, primarily in the unscripted world, documentary, TV series, as well as feature films. And always this was kind of in the back of my mind as, it would be a great story to tell. And I actually got my start in this industry, or in that industry, with that story. I met a director in LA at the time when I was visiting who lived next door to my sister, and I got to talking with him, and he was fascinated by my story. And this was shortly after my book had come out, like a few years later, and asked to see a copy. So I gave him a copy to read, and he read it overnight and came back and said, "Have you ever thought of writing a screenplay about this?" And I had no idea. I'd written a book, but I had never written a screenplay. So he took me into his house, showed me final draft, and basically gave me the basics, and then said, if you want to go back to Portland and write this thing, I'll help you with it, and we can see if we can get this made.
See, that's how it's supposed to work when somebody takes your work. I will help you.
Take notes on that. So I went back to Portland and I busted out just a screenplay. This was for a narrative scripted film, feature film, based on the ELF, and busted it out probably in 3 or 4 weeks. And sent it down to him thinking, oh God, he's going to hate it. This is a guy that at the time he was directing like Bones and Cold Case on TV and had done some films. And he wrote back and said, it's great, it needs polishing, it needs some work, but the basics are there. Come on down again and we'll work on it. So I did, and we worked on it and polished it. And then we shopped it around for the better part of, a year, and nearly got it made. Like is the case in Hollywood. Yeah. And then things fell apart. But that was my little taste of kind of that film industry. And when I was in there, I thought, well, maybe I'll revisit it again. And then a few years later, I started a documentary film on climate change denial called Gritty Line Bastards. And that ended up being just an amazing experience. I shot for 4 years and went around to 14 different countries, and through that experience, that kind of led me to want to pursue more projects. I've always looked for different ways to reach people with positive messages and to get out ideas that can help change the world, and looking at different mediums to do that. Ever since I was in punk rock bands and used to read poetry on stage. So books was another avenue that I still believe wholeheartedly in. But TV and film also are extremely powerful mediums to reach people. And that was and still is my desire to be involved, stems from that. So fast forward on, I was been involved in a number of projects over the years, and then I just decided, why don't I try to start working on this and see? And I think it was originally I was approached by a company wanting to do a piece on the ELF, and I thought, I have my own company. I have amazing contacts now. I've been doing this for 15 years. If anybody should do this, why don't I give a crack at it? But the problem was, I still hadn't met, for the most part, most of the individuals in the ELF. Some of them I knew from being above ground activists prior, Jonathan Paul and Danny McGowan, some of the other individuals, but most of them I never knew. So over a 5-year period, this past 5 years, I've slowly been initiating contact and engaging in discussions and meeting this incredibly interesting group of individuals who are as complex and as different as you can imagine, that came together at one point in their lives, in their young lives, to make a difference in the way they thought was possible. Whether or not it was, whether or not we agree with it, that's what happened, and they were following their heart. And so now, after 5 years, the amount of participation we have on the project is unprecedented. They have more people involved. Just about every single person that we would ever want to tell a story is involved, and that actually is great. So we're excited about that.
That's really cool. And so what's the sort of timeline or prognosis or...
So the project right now, we have been working with Idris Elba's company in London, 22 Summers, and shopping the project right now as one option, and we're waiting to hear back from Netflix and HBO. And if that doesn't work, we'll be going the independent financing route. So.
Cool.
Congratulations.
Oh, thanks.
I'm excited to watch it.
Yeah. I mean, there's like so much I don't know, and I felt like, I followed the news when all that was happening, so I felt like I knew the story, and similarly to yourself, I was like, I don't know if I would do that, but it's like people following their hearts, and it's like they have strong convictions, and like that's what I'm in it for.
Yeah.
And
it's fascinating too, coming from my own story of living one side of the story as the press conduit, if you will, media conduit, and then only kind of knowing the other side from reading court documents and FBI accounts, which aren't going to be fully accurate.
Yeah.
And then to finally getting to meet all these individuals and hearing their own accounts and how those might differ from one another, and then also the court documents. It's a fascinating process.
Oh, man.
Well,
should we wrap up this episode?
Well, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And thanks for doing your book with us. I feel like it will inspire a whole new generation.
Thanks for publishing it.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub,
on Twitter at microcosm,
on Facebook at Microcosm Publishing,
on Instagram at microcosm_pub,
and here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.